Okay, so in previous classes we looked at the planning of supply chain network as a whole, which is very long-term planning decisions. And in today's class, we're going to reduce the planning horizon somewhat and look at aggregate planning decisions. So first of all, any planning decisions is driven by some forecast. Right? So we're going to briefly discuss some basics in demand forecasting. We're going to look at the couple most commonly used and basic forecasting methods. So first of all, we're going to understand the role of forecasting in the context of supply chain, and then understand what are the components for input and output, and two of the basic approaches in forecasting. So the two basic approaches in forecasting falls under time series forecast, and then we're going to look at how to use Excel to perform the forecast and analyze the results of forecast and forecast error. So now, forecasting is the basis for all the planning decisions in a supply chain. We have different hierarchies of planning decisions, and we have different hierarchies of forecasts. So forecasting obviously is used in push process, where we forecast what is the demand going to be for the next month or year, and then according to that we make production scheduling decisions, inventory ordering decisions, aggregate planning decisions, and so on and so forth. But forecast also drives the pull process as well, even though we don't need to design the nitty-gritty of how much production exactly to produce in each period of your planning horizon. But still we need to figure out what is the appropriate capacity, what is the appropriate safety inventory, what is the general inventory level we should be expecting, and so on. And all of these decisions are intercorrelated. So decisions related to forecasting, decision related to production scheduling, sales allocation, promotions, and capacity investment and workforce planning are intercorrelated. So for example, we might have a demand forecast to begin with, for the next maybe half a year or a year. And then as the manufacturer, as the retailer, we plan sales promotion based on demand forecast. And then the sales promotion, of course, is going to affect demand. And so this information will be fed back into demand forecast, and then which will use to be used to decide, say, production scheduling decisions and inventory level decisions and capacity investment decisions, and so on. So some important characteristics of forecast. For one, forecast is always wrong. And as a result, it's very important to understand the level of forecast error. Now, so for example, if we have consider two car dealers. The first car dealer first car dealer faces demand that varies between 100 units to 1900 units. The second dealer faces demand that varies from 900 to 1100 units. So in expectation, we would come up with the same forecast for the next selling seasons, which is 1,000 units. But in terms of inventory management and production planning, these two different demand profile would imply very different policies. Right, so first and foremost, they will imply very different safety inventory levels. And another characteristic about forecast is long-term forecast is usually less accurate than short-term forecast, just because the farther we go into the future, the more uncertainty there is in between. And so this has important implications in terms of planning in supply chain management, because what this means, since one of the principles of forecasting is the forecast horizon has to be greater than the lead time, right? Otherwise, it doesn't make sense. The forecast will not be valuable. Therefore, if you have a short lead time, that means you're able to generate short-term forecasts instead of long-term forecasts, and this implies your forecast is generally more accurate than if you had a long lead time. And then aggregate forecasts are more accurate than disaggregate forecasts. So for example, if we were to forecast the GDP of a whole country, generally the forecast is much more accurate than if we were to forecast the revenue of a single company. And additionally, in last class, we also saw that the farther up we go on a supply chain, the less accurate your forecast is. Right, so this is because of distortion of the information as the information moves up the chain. As a result of this, it's important to conduct collaborative forecast. So different parties in a supply chain will agree on sharing information and conducting forecasting activities together. So when we perform forecasting, we take into account different factors. In practice, we can forecast a lot of different things. The most relevant to us in supply chain is the forecast of future demand. And this is to be extinguished from future sales, because future sales is demand truncated and modified according to your inventory availability. So in order to forecast future demand, one thing we need to is useful to know is past demand. So knowing the history, we can extract some patterns and trends, and then that will help us to understand what the future holds. And then, as I mentioned, the lead time is an important part of forecasting. So that will imply both the implied demand forecast accuracy and also the required forecast accuracy that's needed for us to match supply and demand. And then, since demand is affected by a lot of things, one is advertising and marketing efforts. So, right, if we run a marketing campaign, most likely it's going to affect the demand positively in most cases. And similarly, if we plan promotions, price discounts, that is also, we can expect demand to rise. And then, of course, the state of the economy also have a big influence on demand, as well as what the competitors are doing. So generally, forecasting methods are 4 types. One is qualitative forecasting. So basically, we use the human judgment to generate forecast. So this method is mainly subjective, and they are mostly appropriate only when we don't have sufficient data, and when the experts that is conducting the forecast has sufficient knowledge and experience with the market to generate reasonable forecast. And this is often used as supplements or used to generate forecasts for a new product or a product that's entering a new market. So this is for data unavailable. For example, if we have new products, new market. And then perhaps one of the most commonly used forecasting method is time series forecasting. So in time series, we're going to base our forecast on the assumption that history is a good indication of future demand. And this, of course, is this assumption holds when the pattern of demand does not change significantly from time to time. That doesn't mean that there is no up and downs in demand. It means that the pattern of demand does not change significantly. So in our class, we're going to look at a couple methods for time series forecast. And there are many time series forecast models, and a lot are more complex. And for time limits, we cannot discuss all of them. Another very useful method is causal forecast. So in causal forecast, we try to explain what we're trying to forecast from other more observable, readily available data and information. So one common example is if we're forecasting demand, knowing the price is a very important input. Right? As price increases, demand probably decreases. And lastly, we have simulation. So usually simulation is used when the dynamics of demand or data of interest is very complicated that cannot be captured by a single model. Okay, so in simulation, we may simulate, try to imitate customers' response, customer behavior when with very different inputs such as price, such as inventory levels. And in simulation, you just need to specify the underlying mechanism of how customers' behavior respond to different stimulants. And this may take into account of time series models, causal models, and any qualitative information. So the demand, or the actual demand, or what we observe, can be categorized as systematic component and a random component. So this is what we're trying to capture, the systematic component is what we're trying to capture in the forecasting models, for example, in time series models. So what are the systematic components? So say, over time you have the demand of a particular product. The first systematic component is the level. So, for example, if I average the demand over the whole history of time, it's about, say, 1,000 units. And then on top of level, we may have, say, a trend. So say over time, I see that generally demand is increasing. And this trend can have a linear form or more complex form. And on top of the trend, we may also have seasonality. So every season, the demand may go up and down. Now, so these three are the main systematic components we're trying to capture in time series models. And then there's the actual random component that cannot be quite well explained in a model. So on top of these large discernible patterns, we may have randomness that leads to forecast error. So the difference between the actual observation and your forecast is the forecast error. Now, some important points in the forecasting process. First is we need to understand what is the objective of forecast. So are we using forecast to help us decide production schedules, inventory, or aggregate planning, workforce planning, or something else? And depending on the objective, that will give us the appropriate level of forecast, the appropriate input and output. And then every party that is affected by the results of the forecast or the results decision associated with the forecast should be aware of the link between the forecast and the decision. So for example, when we use forecast as the basis of price promotion, we need to understand how this promotion decision is going to affect different things. So specifically how the promotion is going to affect demand. Right? So if I run a promotion and demand is going to surge, and how much is going to surge, it should be informed to the retailer, the manufacturer, the logistic provider, and everything that's affected by the varying in demand. And the failure to do that will lead to possible mismatch of supply and demand and high costs in the supply chain. And then identifying the different factors that affects the demand forecast. So that includes factors on the demand side. So in time series forecasting, we talk about patterns, trends, seasonality that affects demand, and other factors such as the price, the general economic conditions that can affect demand. And we also need to understand factors on the supply side. The most important thing to understand here is the supply lead time. Right? So imagine if we have an extremely agile supplier that have zero lead time, then there is no need for forecast. Right? So the shorter lead time, the lower the requirement on forecast accuracy. And then we have on the product side, most of the time when we're forecasting the demand of a company is facing, this demand of a product, let's say, could be affected by demand or factors related to other products in the supply chain. For example, if products are substitutable, then the rise of one product could lead to the fall of the demand of the other product. If the products are complements to each other, then we tend to see their demand to rise and fall at the same time. And then it's important to forecast at the appropriate level of aggregation. So because aggregated demand forecast is more accurate than disaggregated demand forecast, so we want to exploit this accuracy as much as possible. Therefore, we tend to want to forecast at the highest level of aggregation without jeopardizing the forecast result. For example, if we are, say, a retailer, and I'm planning the orders for the next week, then first of all, when I place an order to my suppliers, I only need to generate aggregate forecasts for the whole region. Right? So then the supplier will deliver the aggregated product to, say, the distribution center. And then the disaggregate level of demand from each store will only be needed when we're actually making the demand allocation to different stores. And then establishing the performance of and error measures for the forecast. And these measures should be linked to the objectives of the business decisions based on the forecast. For example, we require that the forecast must be made before the lead time. Okay, so we're going to use a one example of a company, Tahoe Salt, that has the historic demand for each quarter of the past 3 years, and we want to forecast future demand for each quarter for Tahoe Salt. So we can see, looking at the data plot for Tahoe Salt, can you identify any patterns? Seasonality. Maybe a little bit of a trend. And of course, the mean is above 0. So the level is positive. Okay, so we're going to look at a couple basic forecasting method. One is moving average, one is exponential smoothing. So in moving average, we tend to moving average tend to perform better for data with no trend or seasonality, and same thing for exponential smoothing. So when we apply moving average to, say, a data with seasonality, we can add seasonality components, or deseasonalize the data first and then use moving average or exponential smoothing. For illustration purpose, we're going to skip seasonality components of the data and then just illustrate how moving average and exponential smoothing works. So the only systematic component of demand that's assumed in a moving average model is level. So no trend or seasonality. And the moving average, for one, we need to first decide how many periods are we averaging over. Right, so if we decide this is moving average with m periods, then the forecast is going to be the average over the last n observations. So simply, our initial estimates, which we denote as LT, so T is our current period, and we estimate the next data point as the average of the past n data points. So demand of the current period, and then demand of current periods minus n plus 1. So once we calculate this estimate then the actual forecast for the next period or the following periods is going to be just equal to this LT. And as time go on, say now we're at time t plus 1, then we can observe t demand in t plus 1. Then we revise the estimates using this formula to generate LT plus 1, and then update the forecast for the following periods using LT plus 1. So as a very simple example, suppose we have a supermarket with a weekly demand of milk, and we have a history of past 4 weeks, and we're using moving average with n equal to 4. So the forecast for demand of period 5 is the 4-period moving average. So L4 is equal to D1 plus D2 plus D3 plus D4 divided by 4, and this equals to 120.75. So our demand forecast for period 5 is just equal to 4 equals 120.75. What is the forecast error? Error is the forecast minus the actual demand. So say we're at period 5 or week 5, and we observe the demand actually turns out to be 125. That means the previous forecast error is minus 4.25. And then once you learn this demand, you can update the estimate and the forecast. Okay, so L5 is D5 plus D2 divided by 4 and equals 122. So, by the way, in moving average, the larger the n, the more stable forecast is. And the smaller the n, imagine the extreme case of n equal to 1, then our next forecast is just equal to the demand of the previous period. So the forecast will be least stable when n is equal to 1. So the second method is a similar approach used called exponential smoothing. And again, exponential smoothing is also applied to data with no discernible trend or seasonality and only level. And so the difference between moving average and exponential smoothing is one moving average doesn't account for very old data. It's after, if it's older than say m periods, then the data gets disregarded completely. Exponential smoothing does not completely disregard any data points, but it progressively assigns smaller and smaller weight to older and older data in the forecast. In contrast, as long as the data point is less than n periods old, they have received the same weight in moving average. So in exponential smoothing, we first need to initialize by creating this initial estimate L0, which is not necessary in moving average. So there are different ways to initialize L0. Following our book, we're going to initialize L0 as the average of all the observations. So in our Tahoe salt, we have 12 data points in total, and L0 is going to average all the data points. So then, say we're at time t, we're going to use LT to be the current forecast. So from L0, we're going to forecast F1 as L0. Right, and then we're going to revise the forecast using the smoothing constants, alpha. So alpha is going to be specified by the forecast. So it's a value between 0 and 1. The larger the alpha, the more discounts older data receives. So the revised forecast is basically a weighted average between the new observation and the previous forecast. And the weight is determined by alpha. So again, using our supermarket data, say we have now 4 weeks of data. Right, so we first initialize L0 as the average of these 4 data points. So we have calculated that is 120.75. From there, we get that the forecast for week 1 is 120.75. And of course, actually, we don't need to forecast week 1 because we already observed the demand for week 1. So the reason why we calculate this forecast is to eventually generate the forecast for week 5. So the updated forecast is the weighted average. Assume alpha is 0.1. So again, this is specified by the analyst. And alpha equal to 0.1 means that L1 is equal to 0.1 times the most recent observation at time 1, so D1, plus 1 minus alpha times L1, L0. So 120.75, meaning that L1 is equal to 120.68. So, and then we can repeat this process. So basically, F2 would be 120.68. And L2 is 0.1 times D2 is 127 plus 0.9 times L1 and equal to 121.31. And then you can update F3 is equal to 121.31 and L3 equal to 120.58, and then F4 is equal to L3, then L4 is 0.1 times D4 is 122 plus 0.9 times 120.58 equals 120.72. And this is our forecast for week 5. And then for the matter of forecast, no matter how long you're forecasting into the future, the forecast is going to be equal to this L4. Equal to F6, F7, and so on and so forth. And then, so to measure the forecast error, once we're able to measure the forecast error, we can determine the accuracy of the forecasting methods and compare between different methods. All the measures of forecast error is somewhat based on this error term, which is the difference between the forecasted amount and the actual demand. So the most commonly used forecasting measure is the mean squared error. So mean squared error is the average of all the error terms squared. And then the AT is the absolute value of error term. Then mean absolute deviation, which is another commonly used forecast error measure, is the average of all the absolute error terms. And then we have this term mean absolute percentage error, MAPE, which is the average absolute error as a percentage of demand. So this is particularly applicable for data with seasonality. And then we have bias terms, or corresponding to bias, we have this tracking signal TS. So bias is the sum of all the error terms. Now, if bias is greater than 0, then we overestimate. If bias is less than 0, then we underestimate. And of course, if it's slightly under or slightly over, then we shouldn't be caring about the bias. So that's why tracking signal is used to compare the magnitude of bias with mean absolute deviation. So basically, if we see a tracking signal that's less than -6, then that means the method is significantly underestimating demand. If TS is greater than 6, then we are significantly overestimating. Okay, so now let's go back to the Tahoe salt example and see how these methods work. So first, if we use moving average, right? So these two columns are the given information. So the period number index and demand values for the corresponding period. Then the first estimate is at period 4 by taking an average of the first 4 observations. And the rest are similar, right? So we can format these values completely just using the same formula. And then the forecast for a given period is equal to LT of the last period. Again, we can input this value and drag to period 13. And then any future period is going to be the last LT. Then all this region is to calculate the accuracy or the error related to this forecasting approach. So we calculate the error of each forecast, which is the difference between the forecast and the actual demand. So you can see sometimes we over forecasted and sometimes we under forecasted. But what we care about is the total effect of these errors. So for one, we can look at the mean squared error term. So in each of these cells, what we're calculating is the total mean squared error till the corresponding period. Right, so this cell is the sum square. Sum square is a function that's first square all the values in the vector and then sum them up. So in this case, we're summing over only one value and then divided by the total number of periods we're averaging over. So 5 minus 6, because right now we only have one forecast. So mean squared error. And then the last one is the total mean squared error of the all the forecasts. So you can see we're summing the square of all these absolute error terms divided by 12 minus 4. So MAD is just the sum of absolute errors divided by the number of forecasts. And then percentage error is absolute error divided by demand. MAPE is the average of these percentage error terms. And tracking signal is the average of bias divided by demand. Divided by MAD, I mean. All right, so of course, as the forecast, you need to decide how many periods you're averaging over. So with 4, you can see the actual forecast is pretty flat comparing to the actual demand. If we're reducing the number of averages, say n equal to 2, then what we'll see is the forecast becomes much more variable. And of course, that will give you a different set of error terms. For exponential smoothing, what we have here is first step is initialization. So L0, this column is L values. L0 is the average of every demand. Then we update L as the weighted average between the past L and the newest demand observation using this smoothed constant alpha value. And then you can format the rest of the cells to generate L. The actual forecast, again, is the L of the last period. And then all these error terms, performance measures, can be calculated in a similar way. Now, with exponential smoothing, when we have this convenient smoothing constant, we can actually ask Excel to choose the constants optimally in order to, say, minimize the error. So what we do is then go to data solver. Right, we'll set objective to be most common objective is mean square error. And then we're minimizing mean square error by changing alpha value. Subject to the constraint, the only constraint we need is alpha should be between 0 and 1. And then using GRG nonlinear to solve. In this case, actually, the best thing is to do this naive forecast that is just the average of all the demand. But of course, that's not the case in some instances. So for example, in this data set, let's say we start with alpha equal to 0, then we use solver to help us choose the alpha value, then it may choose something different for us. So then we can compare different forecasting methods, right? The moving average methods and exponential smoothing methods lead to different error terms, MAD, MSE, or MAPE, and we can see that simple exponential smoothing tend to have a better performance in terms of MAD and MAPE comparing to moving average. Now, some final comments on practicing forecasting in practice. One is the importance of collaborative forecast between different supply chain members. Right, so it's important, as you saw in last week's simulation, for different members to share demand information, to share the data you have, and best of all, to collaboratively forecast demand. And to make sure everybody will end up with the same demand forecast in the end. And then, of course, sharing demand information is costly. You need to build the information infrastructure, and you need to trust one another to be able to share information in an effective and truthful manner. Generally, sharing information, even though it's costly, but the benefit of sharing information significantly exceeds the cost. But we also need to be mindful that most of the time, sharing all details of data is not necessary. So we can avoid unnecessary costs by sharing the appropriate data, the appropriate information, and the appropriate aggregation level. And then important to distinguish between demand and sales. To get true demand, what we actually observe is sales. To get the true demand, we need to adjust the sales observations by stockouts, by inventory levels, any pricing promotions that may potentially affect sales. And failure to do so, to distinguish demand and sales, would lead to a forecast that actually does not represent the current reality. Any questions? All right, let's take a break. All right, so moving on to aggregate planning. So in this part, we're going to look at what is the aggregate planning problem and what is the main trade-off that's considered in aggregate plan. And then we're going to formulate the problem as an optimization, particularly linear optimization problem. And then we'll use, again, Microsoft Excel solver to solve the problem. in aggregate planning, what we're looking at is, one, capacity is costly to build, and because the building of capacity lead time is also very long, then we should be doing the planning in aggregate planning, assuming capacity is aggregate capacity level has already been fixed, meaning that, say, facilities has been built, the network has already been defined, and then based on demand forecast, and we just talked about how to forecast demand in each period in the planning horizon, we're going to decide the production and inventory level and the capacity level, meaning that not that we're going to build any new facility, but how much capacity is to be outsourced and how much internal capacity is to be utilized. And based on this aggregate plan, what is the implied backlogs and implied inventory levels? And the goal is to maximize the profits over the planning horizon, which is similar in this case to minimize the total cost of the aggregation plan, because we usually assume that demand is given. And the essential problem of aggregate plan is how to best utilize the facility resources that we have in the company. Now, in the specified time horizon, we need to specify operational parameters that are identified as factors to help us set the aggregate plan. One is the production rate, so how fast we can produce, and the workforce level, so how many workers or units of labor capacity are required, overtime amount, so how much work is to be conducted using overtime versus regular time, machine capacity level, the number of units of machine capacity needed to complete the aggregate plan. Subcontracting, do we need to subcontract actual capacity in order to fill this aggregate plan? And if, according to the this aggregate plan, what is the implied backlog? Right? Are there going to be demand that is unsatisfied in a certain period, and which is assumed to be carried over into future periods? And the implied inventory on hand, so the planned inventory carried over different periods in the planning horizon. So the aggregate plan generally serves as a blueprint for operations to establish the parameters within which the short-term production and distribution decisions should be made. And the aggregate plan also allows the supply chain to make allocation decisions of production capacities and also change supply chain contracts. And if in the aggregate planning phase, different stages also should be working together. Otherwise, the supply chain performance may not be optimized, and there could be oversupply or undersupply. So what is the aggregate planning problem? Now, the input is the general demand information, right? And then we need to, this is supplemented by cost and time related information. And we need to determine how much to produce, what is the related inventory levels for each period in the planning horizon, what is the capacity levels to be utilized in each period, and the goal is again to maximize profit. Generally, aggregate planning takes place over a planning horizon of months or quarters. So, it's usually typically between 3 to 18 months is the length of the planning horizon. And we also need to specify how long is each period, whether it's weekly or monthly or quarterly. And then we need to define what are the key information inputs to generate aggregate plan. Specifically, information generally fall into several categories. One, the most important thing is the demand forecast. So this is generally the aggregate level demand forecast. So demand forecast for, say, all the product types, all the product categories in the facility. And then costs related to production. This may include costs related to labor, whether it's for regular or overtime, any subcontracting costs, right, for part of production that is not be able to complete in-house, and the cost of changing capacity. So for example, if we want to hire or lay off workers, or add or reduce machine capacity. We also need to know the relationship between labor hours and product output. So per hour of labor, how many units of product can it generate? Same for machine capacity. And we also need cost information related to holding inventory and stocking out or back ordering. Additionally, we need constraints, various types of constraints. For example, the maximum amount of overtime, the limit on number of layoffs, and total capital available, total maximum amount of stockouts, backlogs, and so on. For specific problem, depending on the policy, depending on the environment, we may have different constraints. So what is the aggregate plan output? One is for each period, we need to determine how many products in aggregation do we produce. Right, so, and are these products produced in regular time or overtime or from a subcontracted party? And also for each period, how much inventory is going to be carried over? The number of stockouts or number of back orders in each period, and how many people should be hired or how many people should be laid off, and how much machine capacity should be increased or decreased. Right, so all of this information is very useful to determine our strategies. So, for example, production quantity determines the number of workers and supplier purchase levels. Knowing the amount of inventory will let us know how much warehousing space is needed. And it also will give us information about how much capital do we need in order to hold inventory. Knowing the implied backorder or stock outs will give us insight on the resulting service level of the aggregate plan. Workforce hiring or laying off will help us determine if any labor issues will be encountered. Machine capacity, whether it's increase or decrease, will affect our equipment purchasing decisions. Or how many equipments are idled. And so since it affects so many things, it's important to come up with a reasonable and sensible aggregation plan to avoid lost sales, lost profit, high inventory, or excess capacity. So what are the main trade-offs in aggregate planning? So there's a trade-off between capacity, inventory, and lost sales. Right. The more capacity we build, the less need for inventory. The more inventory we build, the less expected backlog or lost sales. But the more lost sales and backlog, meaning lower service level and lower need for inventory and lower need for high capacity. So in aggregate planning, there are some simplistic strategies to use, and we're going to illustrate each one by one. Overall, there's chase strategy, flexibility strategy, and level strategy. So each of this strategy will focus on utilizing one of these levers in order to design aggregate plan that matches demand with supply. So the chase strategy mainly uses capacity as a lever. Flexibility strategy uses capacity utilization as a lever. And level strategy uses inventory. So these are again, simplistic strategies that doesn't lead to optimal solutions in most cases. So in reality, what we see is more of a tailored or hybrid strategy that combines the above three strategies. And with the help of computer programming and optimization, we can come up with strategies that are better than any one of these three. So, chase strategy. What is chase strategy? So, in chase strategy, we're going to try to match production with demand exactly in each period. And the way we do that is to change the capacity in each period accordingly. If demand is high, then we add capacity or add more workers. If demand is low, then we close machines or lay off workers. And of course, this strategy is difficult to manage because capacity and workforce is often difficult to change on short notice. And if the cost of varying capacity is high, then this strategy will be very expensive to execute. And of course, since the number of workers is depending exactly on demand, then there is a lot of risk of being fired in the workforce, and which will negatively affect workforce morale. And the positive side of this strategy is inventory level will be very low. So we have this negatives and we have this positive. So what makes sense, when does it make sense to use chase strategy is when the positive is important and the negatives are, negligible in comparison to the positive. So in other words, if the inventory cost is very high, right, then we really don't want to hold inventory. So then chase strategy has a value, and it has even more value when it's cheap, what related to monetary cost or morale cost to change capacity. The second strategy, utilization flexibility strategy. So this is somewhat similar to chase strategy. So we're still trying to, match capacity with demand exactly. Although in this utilization flexibility strategy, the approach to achieve that goal is different. So generally, in order to use this strategy, it requires that we have an excess machine capacity to begin with. Right? So this can be in a form that the machines are not utilized 24 hours a day, the workforce don't work 24 hours a day, so then we can schedule overtime for that increases the utilization of the capacity. So in this case, the workforce, the number of workers is kept relatively stable, and instead we vary the number of hours worked. And the way we vary the number of hours worked is by using flexible work schedule or overtime. And so comparing to the chase strategy, because workforce is now kept stable, it has a much better morale situation and solves the morale problem that's in chase strategy. And because it still attempts to match capacity with demand exactly, so we still expect to see a low level of inventory. But on the downside, capacity is, we require excess capacity, so utilization can be quite low. And therefore, the utilization flexibility strategy is most useful when also inventory cost is very high, but we cannot use the chase strategy because either capacity is expensive or changing capacity is very expensive. So lastly, we have level strategy. So in this level strategy, it's the opposite of the previous two strategies' goal. So now we don't attempt to match supply with demand exactly in each period. Rather, we're trying to keep the workforce and the output level constant over the whole planning horizon. Now, so production in level strategy is not synchronized with demand. And in order to still satisfy demand, we're going to have to use inventory. So when demand is high, then we deplete inventory. When demand is low, we accumulate inventory. And worker morale-wise, this is also better than the chase strategy, but inventory and backlog may accumulate, may be excessive over time. So this strategy is appropriate in the opposite scenario where inventory and backlog cost is relatively low. Okay, so in aggregate planning, we're going to actually use a combination of these different strategies. And the first step of that is to identify what is the aggregate product unit. So since in aggregate planning, we're planning the overall production level of a whole facility, right, which may have different types of product, different categories of products. So we cannot use the natural unit of different products to represent the aggregate product. So then we need to first come up with a sensible unit to represent the aggregated product. So the aggregate unit should be identified to ensure that resulting production schedule can be accomplished. The other thing is that we need to pay attention to bottlenecks. And so bottlenecks is, according to theory of constraints, is the most constraining area in any manufacturing facility. So when we do production schedule, it's important to focus on bottlenecks when we select the aggregate unit. And when we evaluate activities such as setups and machine maintenance, it's important to account for the time length for these activities in the aggregate production time. So as an example, let's look at Red Tomato Tools. So Red Tomato Tools is a small manufacturer of gardening equipment and has a facility in Mexico. So this facility produces 6 product families, A through F. And each product family has different material costs, different revenue, different production setup times, batch size, production raw processing time, and shares of units sold. So then what is a sensible aggregate unit for this facility? So what defines an aggregate unit is, one, we want to know the cost for producing one unit. We want to know the production time, right, related to producing one unit. And to calculate profit, we might want to know the revenue associated with the aggregate unit. So can you think of a way to obtain these values? So, okay, say for cost, how do we get the aggregate cost? The cost for an aggregated product.
Number of products produced per hour. So that we get the cost. And for each unit, we get this much amount of. It costs that much. So.
Right. So now we already know the unit product cost for each family. So we can sort of average them over, right? But it's more like a weighted average because different families have different percentage of sales. Right, so we're combining this column with this column. Now, for aggregate cost, we're taking the weighted average of the material cost per product unit for 6 families of product. And it turns out the total material cost for the aggregate unit is $10. similarly, we can calculate the revenue for the aggregate unit. Again, the weighted average of these numbers with the weights in this column. And then the net production time is the weighted average of this column. So revenue is $40 and net production time is 4 hours. And one thing to point out here is this net production time includes setup time and the raw processing time. Right, so how do we get this 5.76 hours? So 5.76 is equal to 5.6 is the raw processing time for each unit of product, plus the setup, 8 hours, but it has to be divided over the batch size, which is 50. Okay, so now that we have defined the aggregate unit and we now know the production cost, the revenue, and the time required to produce the aggregate unit, now we can move on to other inputs. So we need to know demand forecast as the first input. So turns out for red tomato, the demand is highly seasonal. As one might expect, right? They sell garden tools, and in the spring, people plant their gardens, and the tools demand may increase. And in winter, this demand is lower. And the options for the general strategies for tomatoes, red tomato to aggregate plan their production is one, they can, in peak time, they can just hire extra workers, right? And then, or in peak time, they can subcontract the extra work to another company, or they can build up inventory ahead of time.
Overtime. You can put workers in overtime as well.
For which one?
The options thing. Can we do that as well?
Say it again.
Like, can we put workers overtime?
We can, yes, we can also put workers overtime. So, good point. Let's add overtime here. Okay, so now can you match these options to the strategies we talked about? The first one is which strategy? Chase. Build up inventory is which strategy? Level strategy. And this one is flexibility. Alright, so then use demand history. We built up this demand forecast. So based on this demand forecast, we can start aggregate plan. And before we do that, we also need to know some additional information, like where we start, what is the starting status. Say my inventory in the start of the planning horizon in January is 1,000 units. And for each month, there are 20 working days. And for each day, there's 8 hours of regular time. Any time over that is going to be counted as overtime. But we also have a constraint, possibly by labor law, that there is a maximum of 10 hours of overtime for each employee in each month. And we also are shooting to end up with 500 units of inventory in June, so that we don't need to stress too much in the next planning horizon. Alright, so these two can be viewed as constraints. Additionally, we have some other cost information. So we figured out the material cost is 10 units already. The inventory holding cost is $2 per unit per month. And whenever we talk about units, it's the aggregate units that we just calculated. The cost for stock out or back order is $5 per unit per month. Each time we hire a worker and perform new worker training, it's going to cost $300 per person. And each time we have to fire a worker, it will cost $500 of layoff cost. And each unit of product requires 4 hours of labor to produce. The regular time salary is $4 per hour. The overtime salary is $6 per hour. And for each product purchased from an outside supplier, it's going to cost $30 for red tomato. Okay, so these are all the information we need, right? So cost information, demand information, and any time, capacity related information, and any constraints. Decision variables. So we have quite a few things to decide for each period. Right. Our planning horizon is six months. So we have periods T equals 1 through 6. And in each T, we need to decide all of these decision variables. Now, one is how many workers should we have in each month? And because of this workforce size, we may need to hire someone, which is HT, or fire someone, which is LT. And we assume that the hiring and laying off happens in the beginning of the month. And then the total production level in month T, which we denote as PT. And then at the end of each month, we might have some leftover inventory, which we denote as IT. And the other possibility is we might have stock out. So in which case we'll denote the number of units stocked out or number of units back ordered as ST. We might want to subcontract part of the work in each month, and this is denoted as CT. And then in addition to the regular work hours, we might ask the workers to work overtime, and we denote the total number of overtime hours in month T as OT. Okay, so our goal is to maximize profit. But now that our revenue is given for the aggregate product and the demand is given, right? So the total revenue is given, so maximizing profit is equivalent to minimizing cost. So we're transforming the problem to minimizing the total cost related to the aggregate plan. Now, total cost has a few components. One is the labor cost related to regular time, overtime, and costs related to hiring or firing workers, inventory holding cost, stock out or back order cost, and the cost of actually producing each unit of product, and the cost of purchasing a unit of products from an outside supplier. Alright, so mathematically what are each of these terms? Now, labor cost, so for each month we have a worker's size of WT. So regular time worker cost is 20 hours per month, right? Each worker works 20 hours per month multiplied by 8 hours per day multiplied by their regular time salary is $4 per hour equal to 640. And so this is the regular time labor cost in month T, and we sum over all 6 months to get the total regular time labor cost. Overtime labor cost, since overtime is in the number of hours, we can simply multiply it by the overtime cost of $6 per hour and then sum it over for all 6 months. Hiring cost is $300 per person times the number of people hired. Firing cost $500 per person times number of people laid off. Inventory holding cost is $2 per unit per period times the number of inventory at the end of period T to be carried over. And for each unit of stock out, we have incur a cost of $5 per period, right, and sum over all 6 months. And then we have material cost. So each product requires $10 to produce, and the production in month T is PT, and sum over all 6 months. And finally, subcontracting costs is $30 per product times the number subcontracted, sum over 6 months. All right, so this is our objective function. Now we have to establish constraints for the optimization problem. So the following constraint should hold for all t values from 1 to 6. For 1, we need our decision variables to be consistent. Right? So the workforce number should be consistent with our hiring and layoff decisions. Meaning that my workforce in period T should be previous workforce size plus the number of people hired minus the number of people laid off. Right, so this is the workforce dynamic that should be satisfied. The other one is capacity constraints. So basically, capacity constraints means that in each month, what we produce cannot exceed available capacity. Available capacity is determined by how many workers are there and how many hours they worked. So total number produced should be less than or equal to the total regular time worked by the workers plus total overtime divided by the number of hours required to produce a product. Right, so this is actually 640, no. So the number of products produced by WT workers is the number of hours they have worked. Right, so 20 hours per month, 20 days per month times times 8 hours per day. This is the number of hours on regular time, and then plus overtime is the total number of hours worked. This divided by 4 hours per product is the number of products that can be allowed under this capacity.
Can you explain this again?
So this part is the total number of work hours, no matter regular time or overtime, right? And each product takes 4 hours to make. So if I ask these people to work all these hours to non-stop produce products, at maximum they can produce this amount divided by 4 number of products. Right, so the actual production should not exceed this capacity. All right. Then we have inventory balance constraints. So inventory balance constraints. So we have inventory at the end of period T should depend on my previous inventory level, say IT minus 1, right? And minus ST minus 1. So this term is actually the net inventory from the previous period. right? If one of these should be 0, and then plus the extra that's produced during month T, which is PT plus CT. Alright, so this is the amount produced in-house. This is the amount produced from the subcontractor. And minus demand satisfied. So D during T. And I need to adjust the left-hand side by ST in case we actually run out of stock. Okay? So if the right-hand side is a negative number, then IT is 0, and we have a positive stock out value. Alright, so this is net inventory. This is total production. And this is, of course, demand. So basically, the new inventory level is equal to previous inventory level plus production minus demand. Alternatively, we can write it as here. And then we have overtime limit constraints specified in the problem description. Right, so overtime should be less than 10 hours per worker. Therefore, total overtime should be less than or equal to 10 times the total number of workers. And then we have question, yes?
And the overtime 2 hours is for per employees. You use the OTE. Less than equal to 10 times WPT. Then just consider the aggregate overtime.
Right. It's the way that the aggregate planning decision variable is set is such that we cannot actually enforce each person works less than 10 hours. So this is actually a relaxation of that requirement. We just require total overtime is less than 10 times their number of workers. Then, of course, since we do not differentiate between workers, then when we actually plan the overtime, we can allocate these hours among workers such that each person's time is not exceeded. And finally, we might have some other constraints. So, for example, in this specific case, we require the final inventory at the end of month 6 to be 500. And then we might require the terminal back order to be 0. This is 6. And we have integer constraints, right, for the number of workers, number of people hired, number of people fired, and the number of products should be natural numbers, or including 0. Okay, now let's look at this problem in Excel. So in this Excel sheet, this first page lists the demand forecast and the cost. So these are the inputs parameters for the problem. Then the second tab is the actual aggregate planning optimization problem. So in here we have our decision variables, right? Including number of people hired, laid off, workforce size, overtime, inventory, stock out, subcontracts, and production. Demand is also listed here as input, and then indexed by the number of periods. And then this part is calculating the corresponding costs related to these decision variables. Right? So for each person that we hire, it's going to cost $300. So $300 times the number of people hired is the hiring cost for this month. Similarly, layoff cost is $500 times number of people laid off. Let me change this to 0. And say starting workforce is 80 people. Right, we need to have a starting point. And the regular time is the 640 times the number of workers. Overtime cost, inventory cost is the corresponding cost times the corresponding cell in here. Okay, so then the total cost is the sum of all these costs. Right, this sums up all the different categories of cost and over 6 periods. Then we have constraints. Right, so workforce constraints make sure that our workforce dynamic holds. So basically, number of workforce in the current period is equal to previous workforce plus hired minus laid off. Right, so basically what we do is change this equation to WT minus 1 plus HT minus LT minus WT equal to 0. Right. So that's that cell. Capacity constraints is the difference between capacity and actual production. Right, so equivalently, it's the right-hand side minus the left-hand side. And what we want to do is to ensure that the capacity, so the workforce constraints should equal to 0, capacity should be greater than or equal to 0. Inventory should also be 0. Overtime should be less than, so this is again the right hand side minus the left hand side, so greater than or equal to 0. Okay, so now let's go to solver. Our objective is to minimize the total cost here. And by changing the cells, so everything from here to here in the light green field. Subject to constraints, we have quite a few constraints. This one is the integer constraints. Oops. This one is the integer constraints that our number of people should be integers. This one, B5 to I10, makes sure that all of these decision variables are non-negative. So you can just check this without adding that constraint. G10 is stock out, so we shouldn't have any stock out at the end of the planning horizon. Similar here, integer constraint for production quantity, and then these should satisfy workforce constraint are equal to 0. This is greater than equal to 0. Inventory equal to 0. Overtime greater than equal to 0. And so here, because this aggregate planning problem is a linear problem, we still use simplex. Sometimes you might want to check options here, right? So sometimes Excel defaults to this ignore integer constraint, which will give you a decision variable that doesn't make sense. So make sure you uncheck this and then click solve. Alright, so this is our aggregate plan. So basically, we keep the workforce level by laying off 16 people at the beginning, and we made sure that inventory is 500 in the end. All of these constraints are satisfied, and the resulting total cost is 422,660. To visualize this, we can see that the production is a flat line. This is our demand forecast, and sometimes we have inventory left over, sometimes we have stock out. So actually in only month 4 we'll have stock out instead of inventory. And in month 4 we also have some subcontracting. Okay, so that's our aggregate planning problem. So with the Excel sheet, you might experiment with different scenarios. So for example, you might sometimes, when we're unsure about demand forecasts, we might want to experiment with different forecast scenarios, right? So for example, say in this scenario, we have the same level of demand, but higher variability. So in this case, how do you expect the total cost to change? Any guesses?
Would increase.
Cost would increase? Right. So if demand is level, a simple level strategy would suffice, right? But when there is more demand up and downs, we need to either use capacity or flexibility or inventory to compensate. And all of those will increase our costs. So indeed, we'll find the total cost increase by about $10,000. So then from the aggregate plan, we may go to generate another level of details using the aggregate plan. So the aggregate plan formulates the production plan for the aggregate unit, but that doesn't make sense when we have different products. Right, so from aggregate plan, we can generate a so-called rough cut master production schedule, which is actually the input of MRP, so material planning system. So this will specify the total production amount for each type of product. And this is very easily generated from the aggregate plan. So since our aggregate planning decision has already determined the total production quantity, right? So then we can use this total production quantity per month and use our initial inputs of sales allocation. Yeah, so this percentages to calculate the products, number of products for each family of products. Yeah, and then the production time can be also calculated based on the quantity requirements and the setup and raw production time. So it turns out, based on this aggregate plan, the total hours required for production and setup is 10,231.4 hours. And based on this plan, the total capacity is just slightly over. Right, so we're very closely, we have a very high utilization of the total capacity, which can be problematic because the demand may not always be what we expect. So it's always a good idea to leave in some buffer. So this can be done by building flexibility, and flexibility can be built through either safety inventory or excess capacity. So safety inventory is just increase the inventory level in, say, the beginning of the planning horizon each period, so that when demand is higher than expected, we can still satisfy it. Then the other method is building safety capacity or excess capacity. So one is that when we have excess capacity, we can use overtime when demand is higher. And we can hire more people than the lean aggregate planning model suggests, or we can just use subcontractors as a form of safety capacity. Of course, that only makes sense when subcontractors are not prohibitively expensive. And then we can also source products from an open or spot market as another form of safety capacity. Any other questions? If not, that's it for today.